Through the latter half of the 1990s, the video game industry had seen massive shifts in the market. Nintendo and Sega had been met with fierce competition from the Sony PlayStation, which had sold nearly 72 million units worldwide by the end of the decade. The PlayStation hosted a wide and diverse catalog of titles across every genre, but it would be most well defined by the console's unofficial mascot, Crash Bandicoot. With 4 Crash titles under their belt and roughly 20 million copies sold, developer Naughty Dog had made a name for themselves as technical pioneers for the console. But with the PlayStation 2 just over the horizon, and their publishing contract with Universal Interactive long at an end, they would make the decision to start from scratch for the next generation. And it would all be built on the shoulders of a young man and his rodent sidekick. While Crash Bandicoot had put Naughty Dog on the map and acted as an unofficial ambassador for Sony's PlayStation, neither company had any legal ownership of the orange marsupial. As part of their arrangement with Universal Interactive Studios, who had previously published their 3DO fighting game, Way of the Warrior, in summer 1994, Naughty Dog co-founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin would be provided with a bungalow on the movie studio's backlot, and in exchange they would be contracted to develop 3 games for them, with Universal owning the rights to their work. Those games ended up being the Crash trilogy, released between 1996 and 1998. While Crash's international success was a point of pride for all 3 parties, the arrangement between them was not to last. Although Naughty Dog and Sony had cultivated a strong relationship, Universal's ownership of the Crash IP led to some tension with its creators. As Andy Gavin would recall to Games Radar's Alex Avard in 2021,
"Our relationship with Universal had gotten to the point where we couldn't continue to make Crash Bandicoot games. Although we loved Crash Bandicoot and we loved working with Sony, it didn't make any financial sense. Universal owned the IP and there was a hostility there that was just brutal."
After shipping Crash Bandicoot Warped and fulfilling their contract in 1998, Naughty Dog was intent on parting ways with the character that had catapulted them to industry stardom. Most of the studio, under the direction of Jason Rubin, would begin working on a racing game codenamed Project X, which would ultimately become Crash Team Racing, thanks to Sony securing the rights to use the characters for the game. Meanwhile, Andy Gavin was toiling away on developing the code and software for what would come next. Also working on this new engine were programmer Stephen White, who had worked on Crash 2 and 3, and Mark Cerny, who had previously been president of Universal Interactive. He had been responsible for signing Naughty Dog with them in the first place, and was executive producer for the first 3 Crash games. Cerny had had a storied career in the video game industry up to that point, having previously worked at Atari, Sega, and Crystal Dynamics, and had established his own consultancy group, Cerny Games, to continue working with the likes of Naughty Dog, Insomniac, and Sony after leaving Universal. But Cerny's involvement would extend past consulting and programming. In 1999, he would be invited by Shuhei Yoshida, PlayStation's executive producer of product development, to come to Tokyo for 3 months to help Sony's engineers develop a graphics engine for the next generation of PlayStation. Cerny graciously accepted, and this would help give Naughty Dog a leg up in developing for the console. After a failed attempt to pick one up directly from Sony in Japan, as those working customs at the airport believed it to be a, quote, weapons computer, they would acquire a rudimentary PS2 development kit at the LAX warehouses in spring 1999, and the more he tinkered with it, the more Andy Gavin was impressed with it, despite how difficult it was to program for. The machine's complexity belied just how advanced it was, however, as it became evident that the PlayStation 2 was powerful enough to realize Rubin's greatest ambitions for their next-generation project: an open, free-roaming 3D space, and no load times. It was a goal that he had been aiming towards for some time, as he explained in a December 2001 interview with Computer and Video Games.
"We wanted to do load-free since Crash 1, but PS1 couldn't handle it. We wanted to do free roaming since about Crash 3, but but the PS1 couldn't handle it and keep the density of art we wanted for Crash in a 3D world. These things became possible when we got the PS2 specs.
With the power of the PlayStation 2, they were prepared to break down those last remaining barriers to create not just a bunch of levels, but entire worlds. To facilitate this, in true Naughty Dog fashion, Gavin devised a custom programming language to streamline development. It wasn't the first time he had done this, as he and Naughty Dog's very first employee, Dave Baggett, had previously created the Game-Oriented Object Lisp, or GOOL, for the Crash series. But even with GOOL, testing new code for Crash took time. Time to compile, time to link, time to download to the development kit, time to reboot, and time to check if the code and changes functioned. The new language, dubbed Game Object Assembly Lisp, or GOL, would cut down on that time tremendously, allowing code to be adjusted while the game was running without needing to reboot. Any change that needed to be made could be done and tested almost instantly. Work on the project's technical backbone would persist through the entirety of 1999, but that was all that would be done during that first year. There were no characters, no story, no design or aesthetics to build off of. The studio would take December off after the European release of Crash Team Racing, but when they returned, everyone would start working on their next-generation title, codenamed Project Y. All of the artists put forth their ideas for what their next game should look like, including Crash Bandicoot designer Charles Zembillis. There wasn't much direction given, but there was a desire to continue to have cross-cultural appeal with this new hero, as they had with Crash. Initially, they would present the artists' designs to Sony Japan for feedback, and while the Japanese branch was fond of one of Zembillis' stouter and wolf-like designs, the studio wasn't so keen on it. Zembillis would present over 600 pages of artwork to Naughty Dog in their pursuit of a new leading man, including more conventional humanoids, adventurous nobles, and more lithe, anthropomorphic animals with some light Native American influence. But it would be animator John Kim and character artist and animator Rob Titus who would present the designs which would become the foundation for the game's world and art design. From Kim, a young man with long, elvish ears in the midst of Crash's spinning kick, and from Titus, a cartoon otter. With a bit of refinement from art director Bob Raffi, who took inspiration from the likes of Star Wars and the animation of both Disney and Studio Ghibli, Project Y's two leads, still dubbed Hero and Sidekick, were finalized: a village farm boy who was ready to meet his destiny, and his wisecracking animal pal. Now armed with their new engine and protagonists, full development could truly get underway. But between GOL's custom and proprietary nature, a desire for global appeal, the PlayStation 2's complexity, the team's lofty ambitions, and past experience with Universal while working on Crash still fresh in Ruben and Gavin's minds, Project Y's development would prove to be far more tumultuous than anyone could have foreseen. As everybody at Naughty Dog toiled away on Project Y, the cracks in the foundation became apparent. As robust as GOL was, it was still a custom programming language that was written and fully understood by only one person, Andy Gavin. Ironing out its numerous glitches and idiosyncrasies fell exclusively onto his shoulders, while other programmers did their best to work within the confines of what they would derisively call code encryption. All the while, getting the engine to work on the ever-so-complicated PlayStation 2 was a nightmare in and of itself, with levels barely able to be rendered at a single frame per second after 6 months of work. Between the engine troubles and bottlenecks, work on the gameplay itself wouldn't be done in earnest until much later on, leaving level designers unable to gauge whether their hard work was even any good. Between the technical issues and the level designers having to work practically blindfolded, the game just wasn't any fun to play. Meanwhile, the game's emphasis on animation would present new challenges to Rob Titus and lead technical artist Eric Iwasaki. Like Crash before it, Project Y would continue to bring the 12 principles of animation into the realm of video games, In order to do that, Titus and Iwasaki would have to better familiarize themselves with Maya, the 3D modeling and animation software they had been using to create renders for promotional and packaging images. Not only would the pair need to figure out how to animate these more complex characters to allow them to squatch and stretch like a classic cartoon without appearing unnatural, but they would have to teach the other artists how to do the same while staying on top of their own workloads. Most of Project Y's first year of full development, its second year overall, was a chaotic mess. The game barely worked and wasn't fun. The studio was onboarding more staff to take on the workload, but the proprietary nature of Goal meant that new talent couldn't just jump in, and the increased complexity and greater technical overhead of the PlayStation 2 led to ballooning development costs. Whereas the first Crash Bandicoot had cost $2 million to develop, Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin had each sunk about $2.25 million of their own money into Project Y. The writing was on the wall. Development costs were going to rise exponentially in the next generation. Sooner or later, Naughty Dog would have to rely on publishers to stay afloat, which would mean not being able to own what they make. And after the debacle with Universal and Crash, Rubin and Gavin had some reservations about that. But while their relationship with Universal had turned sour, their time working on Crash had secured them a powerful ally in Sony. They took a hands-off approach to whatever the studio was working on, and were interested in continuing to work with them. But because Universal took their Bandicoot and went home after they poured millions into marketing and publishing for them, this time they wanted ownership of whatever it was Naughty Dog would develop. They didn't want the studio to build up another big franchise with the PlayStation brand and take it somewhere else. It was something they absolutely could have done. Naughty Dog was already on top of the world, but as former PlayStation executive Kelly Flock told Rubin at a bar shortly after the launch of CTR, there's nowhere to go from there, except down. It was a sobering thought, and it was one that never left him. Flock had half-jokingly asked him when he and Gavin were going to sell the company, and now, 1 year later, they were seriously considering it. Entering a publishing agreement with Sony would only keep them going in the short term, leaving them once again without any rights or ownership of their work, as development costs would continue to skyrocket. But Sony had been good to Naughty Dog, and Naughty Dog had been good to them. So if they want the golden eggs, why not sell them the whole goose? When Jason Rubin broached the subject of Sony acquiring the studio outright, he was told to write up what he thought the company was worth, and they would sit down to negotiate. After giving them a number, Sony instantly accepted, and on January 22, 2001, Sony Computer Entertainment America would publicly announce their acquisition of Naughty Dog. The 30-person studio was now officially a subsidiary of Sony, their future secured. But despite the new corporate ownership, the studio was still largely left to work as they saw fit. Sony may have owned the goose, but they knew that they had to let the eggs come naturally when they were ready. Their faith wouldn't be misplaced. After 20 months of grueling work, the engine was finally in a state where it could produce the massive environments the team wanted. The art style had long been locked in. Multiple rendering engines and levels of detail had been created to give the open world a proper sense of scale without compromising on performance. And the game's cutscenes were well underway. Most of them would be helmed by Josh Scher, who would join the company in February 2001 as employee number 33 after having worked in feature animation, most notably on the computer-animated Disney film Dinosaur that had released the previous year. Scher sought to bring a more cinematic flair to the game's cutscenes, but even this late into development, they still didn't even have a name. Not for the game, nor its primary characters. They were still labeled as Hero and Sidekick. It was Scher who would suggest what would become the name for the game's hero, Jak. By the time development on Project Y truly started coming together, speculation over the nature of Naughty Dog's foray onto the PlayStation 2 was rampant. Would it be some kind of shooter? Or would they stick with Crash? Hold on, it's definitely not Crash, and they won't say anything until they have something to actually show. It wouldn't be until May 11th, 2001, 6 days before E3, that Naughty Dog would release a teaser on their website, touting a new world filled with adventure, exploration, and discovery, and that the legacy would begin the same day as E3. On the day of the announcement, Jason Rubin felt horribly ill. The stress of the past 16 months was weighing heavily on him. He had gone from being able to check in personally with every artist at Naughty Dog and working closely alongside them, to merely managing them while working solely on particle effects. The Sony buyout had given him some relief, but he was still exhausted and nervous. In 90 minutes, he and Andy Gavin would be taking the stage at Sony's E3 press conference to officially unveil Jak and Daxter, the Precursor legacy. Expectations were high. The pressure to successfully follow up on Crash Bandicoot, possibly even higher. He had to steel himself for just a little longer. He just had to wait for SCEA Senior VP Jack Tretton to call him and Andy onto the stage, show the game, talk about their technical achievements, gas up the PlayStation 2, and talk about how excited they were to be a Sony subsidiary. About 15 minutes into the presentation, their number came up.
I'd like to bring up the two co-presidents of Naughty Dog, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin.
After a brief recap of the success of Crash Bandicoot, they finally showed what they had been working on for the past 2 years. The crowd responded well, and after about 10 minutes on stage, Rubin encouraged them to check out the game at their booth. With his part of the conference over and done with, before too long, Rubin felt perfectly fine. Early impressions of Jak and Daxter were overwhelmingly positive, with IGN's Douglas C. Perry, Dave Zadirko, and David Smith each praising the scale and clarity of the world, the animation, and control, as well as noting how it still feels like Crash in style and aesthetic, while also carving out its own identity. EGM were similarly excited to see Naughty Dog more directly take on the formula of Super Mario 64. The independent PlayStation magazine would name it one of the top 5 best PS2 games of E3, alongside Maximo Ghosts to Glory, Devil May Cry, Metal Gear Solid 2, and Final Fantasy X. After nearly 3 years of development, a corporate buyout, nearly $15 million in development costs, and a small delay from Thanksgiving to early December for additional QA and bug fixes, it was looking like Naughty Dog and Sony had another Crash-level success on their hands, even if the Bandicoot himself would hit the PS2 before his successors. But market tastes had begun to shift by the time the dynamic duo hit store shelves. The success of titles like Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Solid 2 had signaled that a new era for the games industry had begun, an era characterized by games targeting older players who had grown up with the original PlayStation, and those who began to shun the likes of Nintendo for being quote-unquote childish. But the PlayStation 2 was in a strong position thanks to the popularity of its predecessor and the discontinuation of the Sega Dreamcast that January. By the end of September, Sony had shipped over 19.57 million PS2s, and despite industry buzz surrounding Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox, the former was cursed with the aforementioned perception of being kiddie, while the latter was a completely unproven wildcard. But Jak and Daxter was just one in a sea of highly anticipated games hitting the PS2 that holiday season, and with the desire for more adult games growing, whether it could stack up to Crash's success was completely up in the air. There was nothing left to do now but wait and see, as Jak and Daxter, the Precursor legacy, would hit store shelves on December 4th, 2001. As was the case with the Crash trilogy, Jak and Daxter opens with a cinematic to introduce the player to the game's world, characters, and story. It's not terribly complicated either. One night, two village boys, the confident and adventurous Jak and his clumsy, cowardly friend Daxter, are hanging out in a boat docked on the coast of their village when, after Jak helps Daxter climb back in after falling overboard, the boat starts heading toward the nearby Misty Island. Despite Daxter's protests and their village elder, Samos the Sage, telling them to never go there, Jak gets curious and decides to have a look around. While there, they bear witness to a gathering of monstrous lurkers being commanded by two ominous figures with clammy gray skin to seek out artifacts left behind by the mysterious precursors who built their world, as well as any source of eco, which Samos described in his narration as the life energy of the world. While continuing their sweep of the island, Jak and Daxter find a pool of dark eco, where they find a strange precursor artifact that responds to Jak's touch. But when one of the lurkers confronts them, he throws it at the beast to defend himself and Daxter, who he accidentally knocks into the dark eco after being knocked back himself by the artifact's explosion. Moments later, the eco spits Daxter back out, transformed into a small orange rodent which is never named in-game, but the blurb on the back of the game's case refers to it as an Otzel, a portmanteau of otter and weasel. Obviously distressed about Daxter's new furry form, the next day the pair go to consult Samos about how they could possibly turn him back. After some chiding for disobeying him and hurling insults at Daxter specifically,
"Because in my professional opinion, the change is an improvement."
Samos says that while he can't help them, he thinks that another sage who lives far in the north, Gal Acheron, may have a chance at undoing his transformation, thanks to the years he's spent studying Dark Eco. But to get there, they're going to need power cells to power a special hovercraft made by the sage's daughter Kira to brave the deadly terrain separating them from Gal's lab. That, in a nutshell, is the basic plot and core conceit of Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy. Like Crash, it's not terribly complicated, but it's elevated significantly by its presentation and scope. All of the Crash games developed by Naughty Dog, including CTR, had opening cutscenes to lay out their basic premises, and they got longer and more ambitious with each installment, but none were even half as long as Jak's intro, nor quite as dense or enticing to look at. The cinematography was largely handled by Josh Scher, and the opening does a superb job of pulling you in between Scher's camera work, the score, Samos' narration, solid pacing, and the vibrantly animated characters. There's enough here in just these 6 minutes of introduction to not only get the player on board with what's going on, but to pique their curiosity and prompt them to wonder about the same things that Samos does in his narration. Who were the precursors? What happened to them? How did they harness the power of eco? Does Jak have that same power? All interesting things to consider, especially as you start getting your feet wet and explore this vibrant and mysterious world. But before you can even leave Jak's home of Sandover Village, Samos demands that he and Daxter do a bit of light training at Geyser Rock. It's here where you learn the fundamentals of movement and Jak's overall move set, which remains largely unchanged throughout the game. Thanks to the analog controls, Jak is able to walk slowly or run quickly based on how far you tilt the left analog stick, but he can also double jump, high jump out of a crouched position, jump out of a roll, spin kick like Crash, and dash forward to punch enemies. He feels great to control, with his various rolls, jumps, and attacks able to be strung together seamlessly for a variety of movement tech. His rolling long jump, for example, is not only a great way to cover longer distances, but it can also be used to attack enemies. Jumping after a punch results in an uppercut attack. Punching while in the air has him perform a diving punch back onto the ground. Spin kicks in the air will actually increase airtime a little bit, making platforming just a bit easier. And not only are all of the animations for these actions great, squashing and stretching Jak's model much like how you'd expect of classic cartoons, complete with Daxter hanging on for dear life, but they were made to blend seamlessly with each other. John Kim paid close attention to the little things in their animation, especially with Daxter. His main inspiration for the sidekick's movement in relation to Jak was Abu from Disney's Aladdin, constantly crawling all over him and his physical reactions to Jak's movement being comically exaggerated. It adds a ton of personality through sheer physicality. Jak's abilities can be enhanced further, at least temporarily, thanks to the power of eco. In the context of the world itself, eco is, as Samos describes in the opening, its life energy, but it also has presence as an actual game mechanic. There are 5 types of eco, with each having different properties. Blue eco lets Jak run faster, automatically break most types of boxes simply by approaching them, draws in precursor orbs and scout flies, and even activate dormant precursor artifacts like launch pads, doors, and orb deposits. Green eco acts as this game's health, with a live system thankfully nowhere to be seen. Jak can take up to 4 attacks before dying, and picking up green eco revitalizes him. One big piece of it will restore a section of his health gauge, with 50 small pieces being equivalent to 1 big piece. His gauge only has 3 spaces, but he can have up to 50 green eco in reserve to act as his 4th hit. The big pieces are few and far between, but just about every enemy and wooden crate will drop at least a couple small pieces. Red eco makes him move a bit more slowly, but powers up his attacks. They hit harder, able to beat lurkers that normally take 2 hits with just a single blow, but their range is also ever so slightly extended. It also allows Jak to destroy dark eco boxes without taking damage if you hit them just right. Yellow eco lets him shoot fireballs using the punch button. They have basic homing properties, but you can aim them manually by using the triangle button to put on your goggles and enter a stationary first-person mode, though while doing this, they no longer home in on targets. The last type of eco you'll come across is also the only one you can't use. Dark eco, the very thing that changed Daxter into his current furry form. Be it in crate or liquid form, dark eco will hurt you. Thankfully, boxed dark eco is clearly marked so you won't be taken by surprise, and even if you accidentally hit it, you'll only lose 1 hit point. Pools of it though, that's instant death. It's a destructive and corrupting substance, and some of the things you'll do on your journey will see you curb dark eco infestations, notably with plants and crystals. All of these ecos are found strewn throughout the game world, sometimes in crates, other times lying around, and sometimes pouring out of vents, the latter of which will give you a full charge. But sometimes you may come across an eco vent which has been capped off, meaning you have to find a way to activate them elsewhere. It makes the world at large feel that much more connected and holistic when something you do in one area will allow you to fulfill objectives in another. It supports the idea of this not just being a series of disconnected levels, but a cohesive whole, especially considering that it was one of the core goals of the project. Jason Rubin wanted to have a large world that could be explored freely without a single loading screen, and the team at Naughty Dog succeeded in this, though not without a bit of cheating and technical trickery. Right from the beginning, you're able to see structures and other points of interest far in the distance that you will eventually go to over the course of the adventure, from the temple in the middle of Forbidden Jungle, to Misty Island, to the Zeppelin over Boggy Swamp. This was all possible thanks to these landmarks being rendered at various levels of detail in accordance with how far away you were, with different parts of the environment obscuring your view of distant areas while higher levels of detail are loaded in. And in situations where there isn't anything to block your view, the camera will automatically move to a certain position when you moved past a certain spot, so that you don't see the more detailed geometry and textures pop in. This is most evident here in Sandover Village when moving towards Sentinel Beach along the coast. The camera was paid special attention from the start of development, as in the team's opinion, all 3D cameras in the medium at that point had problems. The challenge of creating a camera that would behave in a dense 3D space without being a hindrance was seemingly impossible, but the team took on the challenge anyway. They wanted it to always keep Jak in view, be optional to control, and keep players from getting sick, which, while not exactly a common issue, was common enough to be concerned about it. With all this in mind, Jak and Daxter's camera is something worth admiring. Control is tied to the right analog stick, which at the time wasn't exactly standard. Moving the stick up and down doesn't move the camera higher or lower, but rather brings it closer to or further from Jak, making him the focal point at all times. And while it follows him and always keeps him in frame, it doesn't always move in tandem with him. When Jak jumps, the camera stays steady. When he turns, the camera will gradually turn with him. The gradual, deliberate motion was intentional to fight against motion sickness. Structurally, the game's areas are laid out in a sort of hub-and-spoke style. There are specific areas connected by a linear path you traverse via Kira's A-Grav zoomer when you collect enough power cells. It feels a bit loose, but I find that this lends it a needed sense of weight while maintaining the feel of riding something hovering above the ground. It'll drift a bit and can't stop on a dime because there's no friction, just wind resistance. The hub areas are connected to a handful of smaller, more contained levels. Some of them, like the Boggy Swamp and Lost Precursor City, are very linear in their construction, but others like Forbidden Jungle and Spider Cave are far more open-ended in the order you're able to tackle the different objectives. Your primary goal is to collect a certain number of power cells to power up a device to allow you to move on to the next area. First it's 20, then 45, and finally 72, with a total of 101 in the entire game. They're basically this game's equivalent of Super Mario 64's Power Stars, or the Jiggies from Banjo-Kazooie, with their acquisition coming from completing various tasks in each area. There is a certain consistency to a selection of them, as each hub area will have a handful of characters who will trade one for 90 Precursor orbs, which themselves are scattered throughout each area with a total of 2,000 in the entire game. The Precursor Oracles, large statues of exaggerated and gaunt faces, also award 2 power cells for 120 orbs each. And every section has 7 scout flies that Kira sent out for reconnaissance that have been captured and boxed up by lurkers. Finding all of them in an area nets you a power cell. Jak and Daxter is a collectathon 3D platformer, but those are the only 3 collectibles, and even then the orbs and scout flies are only a means of acquiring power cells, which is the only one that really matters. They're also, predictably, the only collectible with any real variance in their acquisition. While the Lost Precursor City has a couple of its scout flies attainable through timed challenges, you're otherwise going to be finding them by using Jak's dive attack on their boxes as you find them, and Precursor orbs can be found in the open and in occasional locked boxes that need to be destroyed with yellow eco or bomb cannons. But power cells are much more objective-based. Bring down the Flet egg from the cliffside, survive an ambush, reach the top of a tall structure, herd some mole rats back into their den, beat a time trial. The sheer variety in how you acquire them keeps the game fresh and always provides ample options for the player. If you're struggling with one, you can pass on it and do another. I always feel giddy as I waltz into a new area, ready to clear out every single power cell and precursor orb to be found. But more than that, it's exciting to see what the next zone is going to bring to the table aesthetically. They're all wholly distinct. A quick glance at any given area will tell you exactly where you are. Even the skybox can reflect this, with Rock Village being a prime example. It's always overcast here and in the surrounding areas, with the game's natural day and night cycle being less prevalent thanks to the abundance of dark clouds. This organic passage of time makes the world feel that much more tangible, in addition to how they're designed. Sandover Village is a quaint little coastal settlement with huts reminiscent of Crash's house from Crash 3. Samos even has one of the man-eating plants chilling in his hut. Rock Village, meanwhile, has its residents living high above the ground and out of reach of the player. You don't interact with quite as many of the villagers here as in Jak's village, but it can be easily rationalized that they're hunkering down in their homes while the monstrous claw continues to rain chaos upon them. Their resident Blue Sage was working on a device to lift the massive boulder blocking the path up to the beast, but he's recently disappeared. The world overall is gorgeous, from the darkest caves and corridors to the sweeping vistas. You can even see Sandover Village from the top of the Citadel at the end of the game after beating the final boss. Seeing how far you've come at the end of your journey is extremely gratifying, but also, just look at this view. It's positively breathtaking. And some of you may be thinking, I bet this would look much better in widescreen, which I would agree with. Except, while Jak and Daxter does support a 16:9 aspect ratio, in addition to 480p progressive scan by holding X and triangle during startup, setting the game to 16:9 doesn't actually widen the frame or present additional detail. It merely crops the original 4:3 image. Pay close attention to the tree on the right side of the frame and the ground at the bottom here. There's really no reason not to play this game in 4:3. You would be losing visual information otherwise. Speaking personally, I want to take in as much of these environments as possible, and I don't mind pillar boxing on a modern display. I do, of course, have a few favorite locations, be they for their aesthetics, design, or gameplay. The Lost Precursor City, being so deep underwater, is cast in these cool dark blues throughout its halls and chambers that make the electrified pools and canals inside really pop. It sparks the imagination and makes you wonder more about these mysterious precursors whose artifacts litter the landscape. The area's linearity and the possibility of being trapped down here if you aren't fast enough to activate these spheres, or outrun the rising pool of dark eco at the very bottom, also really make it stick out in the mind. I struggled a lot with that final run at the end as a kid, but these days it's basically a one and done for me. In almost complete opposition to that, Snowy Mountain is bright and open in its looks and construction. There are a ton of things to do that'll see you traverse the disparate caves and peaks several times over. Sure, there are some ice physics here and there, even on the rickety bridges that are missing planks, but thanks to Jak's forward punching move, it's pretty easy to correct your trajectory and quickly gain some momentum. And Sentinel Beach, while crawling with different enemies along the shores and cliffs, and always being bombarded with, well, bombs, is especially cozy to me. Absolutely one of my favorite beach-themed areas in the medium, if not my most favorite. The music here definitely helps in that regard. Mark Mothersbaugh and Josh Mansell, the composers for Crash 1 through 3 and CTR, returned for Jak and Daxter, and they've done a terrific job of imbuing life and soul into each environment. The score lies somewhere between rhythmic, melodic, and ambient, drifting between a brief but distinct set of notes and just letting the music breathe via lower tones and percussion that feel naturally part of the environment. These ambient parts help prop up the mysterious and mystical elements of the world too. Everywhere you look, you'll find some remnant of the precursors that shaped it. Geyser Rock, the very first level, has several of these massive robots sticking out of the rocks and cliffs. Their oracles appear near the villages, but seemed to have been dormant for millennia before Jak's presence awakens them.
Who awakens the oracle? Wait, one of you has the light within. From before time, I have watched and waited for the true hero to return.
They've left behind temples, ruins, underwater cities, and vast networks of flowing eco. These dormant remains and their creator's disappearance give it all a tremendous weight. If these seemingly godlike beings were able to do all of this and shape the world, why aren't they here now? It's a question that Samos' family had been trying to answer for generations, but it happened so long ago that even the rocks don't recall anything. There's a metafictional component to this as well in the form of the Precursor language. It can be found here and there throughout the game, particularly on the Precursor orbs, and it adds an additional layer of mystery to them, though in truth, it's a simple cipher. Each character corresponds to a single letter in the English alphabet. As far as I'm aware, a key wasn't made public at the time of the game's release, but Naughty Dog provided a sort of Rosetta Stone through the game's original teaser trailer, which shows a set of characters changed into The Legacy Begins. The 12 letters given there would probably be enough to decode the rest through the use of context clues. This extends even further to the text printed around the edge of the map that came with the game's PAL release, which seems to describe a prophecy that would lead to learning the deepest secrets of the world they left behind. It's all really fascinating, and yet it probably passed most players by, either because of the esoteric nature of decrypting it, or that particular map being tied to a specific area of the world. Come on guys, think of poor Timbley. Why would you deprive his inquiring young mind of such a neat little bonus? But the derelict nature of the Precursor's legacy doesn't mean the world is lifeless. On the contrary, Jak and Daxter will meet plenty of people as they continue traveling north. Granted, most of them reside in the hub areas, and they become sparser as you progress, but they make the whole world feel that much more lived in. They all feel distinct in their personalities, and none of them feel superfluous. They all have at least one power cell they'd be willing to give you, most of the time for 90 orbs, but most of them do have other objectives tied to them as well, or otherwise there's usually a specific reason they want those orbs. Jak's uncle, for example, is an explorer who needs provisions for an upcoming expedition, and those orbs would allow him to pay for them. The geologist in Rock Village will give you two, one for bringing her 90 orbs to fund her research, and another for herding the mole rats in the Precursor Basin back to their dens. The fisherman out in the jungle, who incidentally is voiced by Batman himself, Kevin Conroy, may he rest in peace, will give you a power cell and let you use his fishing boat, the one that wasn't thrashed by a lurker shark, to go to Misty Island, but only if you catch 200 pounds of fish for him. This minigame gave me so much trouble as a kid, but now I can get it done just fine. Just don't ask me to do an endurance run on the hard mode you can unlock afterward. There's a sense that the people you meet are actually people and not just here to facilitate the collectathon. They're nothing deep or profound, of course, and interactions with them cease completely after you've cleaned them out of whatever they have, but they're all memorable and sport unique quirks and personalities. The mayor in Sandover is focused on re-election. The gambler in Rock Village doesn't know when to quit. The miners at the volcanic crater are a simpleton who's easily taken advantage of and an old grump. Even their designs are fun to look at, with the aforementioned miners having a canary and an open flame on their heads, the gambler being forced to wear a barrel, and Bayou Billy looking exactly how you'd expect a guy named Bayou Billy who doesn't know what a bathtub is to look like.
What's a bathtub?
What I find kind of interesting is that, despite the emphasis the story places on Eco and the Precursors, the denizens of this world aren't really wrapped up in all of that. For most of them, Eco and Precursor artifacts are just facts of life, purely background elements. Eco provides power, the orbs are a form of currency, and the structures left behind aren't really given much of a second thought. It's basically just Samos, Kira, and presumably the other sages who really care about these mysteries. But even after dedicating their lives to studying them, they still know very little. However, Samos suspects that the answers to their burning questions may lie on Jak's shoulders. The 1990s was the era of the mascot platformer. Mario had been well established, Sonic came running onto the scene, and a whole host of other failed or otherwise less successful characters would come and go throughout the decade. Crash Bandicoot was the biggest outlier, having sold over 22 million units by the time Jak and Daxter was revealed to the public. Those were some pretty big shoes to fill, so big in fact that they needed 2 sets of feet to do it. But while Daxter was designed with a singular vision, much like Crash, Jak was more or less designed by committee. This was in order to maintain the international appeal that the team had found with Crash without making market-based alterations after the fact this time. And at least in my opinion, the design, at least conceptually, works. So much of it was carefully considered for what the character would be doing. His goggles provide a targeting reticle for first-person mode, as well as shield his eyes from the wind when riding the zoomer. His singular shoulder plate gives Daxter a spot to perch without his claws digging into his skin. The bag strapped to his back gives him a place to store power cells, orbs, and scout flies. The foot straps give his feet protection while still imparting the idea that he's a rural villager. However, he clearly stands in between multiple worlds. He's not quite anime, not quite Looney Tunes, not quite comic book. His look embodies all three in different ways, but not in any way that's instantly identifiable. You kinda have to know what you're looking for, and even then, if you do hone in on something, it's almost certainly diluted by the other 2 inspirational elements. Jak stands in contrast with Crash, being more tall than wide and identifiable primarily by the color blue. This contrast is easy to see with Daxter, who retains Crash's primarily orange coloration. They're complementary colors, inversions of each other on a color wheel, and they share yellow as a secondary color, which helps Jak stand out from any environment. But their primary colors are also representative of their respective personalities. Jak isn't exactly passive or timid. He's quite adventurous and daring, but not one to speak up much. He certainly tries to on occasion, but he's always interrupted by the loudmouth and wisecracking Daxter. Despite being turned into an Ottsel, he has a massive ego that's unbecoming of his cowardly nature. He talks a big game and is willing to take all the credit for Jak's work, or heroically offer to hang back and defend Kira while Jak goes to handle a big monster. But what makes him endearing are that nobody takes him seriously, and that Max Casella gives such a lively and charismatic performance.
Aren't there a lot of lurker sharks in that water?
Why? Are you scared?
Me? Of course not. Just looking out for Jak here. You know what a chicken he can be.
That last part is especially important, given that you'll be hearing Daxter's quips pretty much every time you die.
I was right behind you, Jak! Really, I was.
And also because of Jak's status as a silent protagonist. He isn't a mute, and he does make different grunting and shouting noises during gameplay, which allegedly were provided by an uncredited Aaron Lore, but the decision to keep him silent was made for the benefit of the player, to make it easier for them to embody him. This is why Daxter is here, because he's the sidekick, and you're not playing as him. As such, he has so much more leeway to speak during gameplay and cutscenes in such a way that the player wouldn't feel disconnected from the character they're controlling. It's all very deliberate, and perhaps even a bit of a response to the idea of a Crash Bandicoot cartoon that was being considered for a time. Crash opening his mouth and talking would have been anathema to his character, and Jak talking was seen as something to avoid as well. But Daxter? Sure, let him go off. He can be as sardonic as the players who felt they were too old for Mario, and Casella nails it. It feels like he's been preparing for this role his entire life. But I suppose it helps that he also played a very similar character in Dinosaur the previous year. He had also recently started appearing on some crime drama or something. There's a decent amount of humor to be found in the pair's interactions. Jak is a bit more reserved in his expressions, but Daxter is much more impulsive. He'll say something ridiculous or embarrassing, and Jak will roll his eyes or smack him in the back of the head. They complement each other wonderfully, and while their personalities do clash, the game never forgets to remind you that, yes, they are best friends through and through. It's conveyed through the stellar animation, be it whenever you pick up a power cell or through idle poses. They'll do a little victory dance whenever you get another cell. Jak will balance Daxter on his head, or when hanging on a ledge, Daxter will try and help Jak climb up for a moment before realizing he doesn't have the same tremendous upper body strength as his friend. It's these little moments that really show that the duo are thick as thieves, and that Jak is willing to walk to the ends of the earth to help turn his friend back to normal. But there's a bit more to Jak than meets the eye. His ability to naturally channel Eco is apparently unique, and he has the latent ability to interact with at least some of what the Precursors left behind. We don't learn much of his background before the start of the game, but Samos the Sage has a particular interest in him. He acts as Jak and Daxter's mentor figure for their adventure, giving them and the player some guidance on what they should probably do on each new leg of their journey north. Being an eco-sage with an interest in the Precursors, it's usually tied to those interests. Uncover his green eco-wells, cure a dark eco-infestation, destroy some dark crystals. What makes him memorable is his surly demeanor. While Samos is a wise sage, he is still very much an old man who has to give guidance to an adventurous yet mild-mannered teenager and his half-witted furball sidekick. He has little patience for tomfoolery, and even when the pair do as he says, he doesn't immediately change his tone. All that being said, Samos isn't an unreasonable man. His standards may be inversely proportional to his expectations, but they're all couched in a certain pragmatism and awareness of the world around him. Warren Burton's performance captures the essence of this character wonderfully, allowing Samos to be both dignified and crotchety without feeling in any way forced or unnatural.
Fine, fine. Adventure away then. And while you're out adventuring, why don't you make yourself useful? My darn green eco-collectors are clogged up again. Head out to the far side of the beach and clear them out, why don't you? Now, all of you, get out of here!
His design is as thoughtfully considered as Jak's. His green skin not only invokes the idea of nature, but also reflects his relationship with green eco. To further emphasize his connection with nature, he wears a big log on his head, which houses a small bird that flutters about when he makes sudden movements. And according to the game's design bible, the logs that he uses as sandals are meant to separate his feet from the ground, as, quote, feet are never allowed to corrupt the earth. It's a fun notion that I hadn't considered, but seeing as how he can often be seen floating above the ground, it makes sense that he would think of feet as something that would taint the beauty of their natural world. It makes you wonder how he feels about everyone around him having exposed toes and heels. There is one last wrinkle in the Green Sage's character, however. He's the father of Jak's love interest, Kira. Like Samos, she's interested in the precursors and eco, but her passions lie more in mechanics and machines. She's the one who built Jak's zoomer and figures out how many power cells you'll need to power its heat shield, or the Blue Sage's lifting machine to move on to the next part of the game. As the fourth member of the team, she's a consistent presence throughout the adventure, pointing you towards certain objectives like her father. But whereas Samos points you towards ecological problems that need to be rectified, Kira steers you towards sites of seeming significance to the precursors, specifically the temple deep in the Forbidden Jungle and the lost precursor city off the coast of Rock Village. Between her and her father, the player is directed towards both the mysterious and naturalistic aspects of Jak's world, with each of them getting into contact with him via his remote communicator when certain objectives that fall under those respective umbrellas are completed. Kira's interests aren't all that separate her from Samos, however. Whereas the Green Sage is often grouchy, Kira is fairly peppy and upbeat, though she does share a bit of her father's impatience with Daxter, who tries acting like he's the real hero and flirting with her once or twice. Rather than just shout him down, though, she gets snarky.
Baby, what do you say you and I go cruising on this A-Grav Zoomer?
Rule number 1, I don't date animals.
You don't know what you're missing.
I personally enjoy Ana Garduño as Kira. Her voice is a bit high and tends to crack, but I think it suits the character's youthful and excitable demeanor. It's also instantly recognizable. I don't think I've ever heard another voice actress like her. Her performance is a bit exaggerated at times, but at no point would I describe it as being bad. Between Jak, Daxter, Samos, and Kira, you've got a pretty well-rounded core cast who all feel like natural parts of this world. Their pasts are hardly discussed, but their interests, personalities, relationships, and clothing all offer just a bit of additional insight into the setting. You can infer that Jak's adventurous spirit may have come from his uncle, while Kira's interests in eco and the precursors comes from her father. Though Kira also offers a small window into what was ultimately left on the cutting room floor. There was originally meant to be a bit more tension between Kira and Samos stemming from her interest in mechanics outweighing her interest in eco, even though one of her life goals was to become a sage like her father. Like Jak, she also wears racing straps, which in the design bible is left open-ended regarding whether she has an interest in racing or is wearing them to spite dear old daddy. Parts of this are still in the final game, but any disappointment Samos may feel for Kira's interests is pretty much stripped out. The zoomer itself, while still prevalent in the final game, was meant to be used a bit more in earlier plans. In fact, the final boss was meant to be preceded by one final chase with it. But as it is now, the zoomer has enough of a presence that it's still a major part of the experience. It's how you get from one hub area to the next, there's a section of Misty Island dedicated to it, and the Precursor Basin is only traversable with it. In fact, the latter has a time trial event complete with a checkered finish line. It's even complemented by the use of the Flut, whose egg you helped save early in the game, being used a couple of times in Boggy Swamp and Snowy Mountain, providing a little bit of variety to vehicular gameplay. But while Kira initially mentions certain points of interest when you talk to her for most of the game, once you get to the third hub area, the volcanic crater, she doesn't do that.
Hey guys, keep collecting power cells. They're the key to continuing our journey north.
And while Samos directs you towards Spider Cave here, the only other non-transitory location connected to the crater is Snowy Mountain. The other two hubs had 3 areas connected to them, so why not this one? Especially since it's the last hub before the finale. This gives a sense of the story, at least through gameplay and world design, feeling a bit incomplete. It was established right at the start that the other sages hadn't turned on their warp gates for a while, and visiting the Blue Sage's lab in Rock Village gives you the impression that you'll go to villages for every sage. But not only is the Red Sage's place in the middle of a volcano, where the only other NPCs are 2 miners who have 4 power cells, but the Yellow Sage's lab and where he lives are kind of in limbo. Kira tells you to turn on the gate to his lab at the end of the lava tube, but all that's there is the final dungeon. There is a hut jutting out of the wall that some players have taken as being the Yellow Sage's lab, but its placement right at the end of the lava tube and across from the villain's base of operations raises enough questions to cast doubt on this being the intention. Sure enough, the design bible shows a sketch of an earlier plan for the game world that would have not only included an additional area tied to the volcanic crater, dubbed Sierra, but 2 additional villages beyond it. The first, the home of the Yellow Sage, would have been up on stilts and connected to areas earmarked as Precursor Ruins, Savannah, and Cave Under Falls, with the latter possibly being reworked into the Spider Cave. The other, which would have been the last hub of the game, was meant to be entirely underground along with its connected areas, labeled Precursor Foundry, Underground Forest, and Underground Boss Citadel. However, out of all of these scrapped ideas, the only one that we know for certain had actual development time spent on it was the Sierra level, which was found buried in the game's September 2001 preview build under the name Yosemite. According to one of the game's designers, Evan Wells, it was one of a handful of levels that the team had created and put large amounts of time into that ended up being cut. Yosemite had been revisited late in development as one of the last levels to be worked on, with the hope that all of the knowledge they had built up over the preceding months and years would be enough to get the level working like they wanted. Unfortunately, there just wasn't enough time. Interestingly, one of the leftover strings tied to Yosemite in that preview build was to find the red eco vent switch, much like how you could unlock all of the game's blue and yellow eco vents in other levels. To me, red eco had always felt underutilized throughout the game. It only pops up on Misty Island and Snowy Mountain, whereas blue eco is basically everywhere and yellow eco is in most areas past Rock Village. I had always wondered about such an elusive red vent switch, and now I know that it got cut. At the same time, though, having it be attached to the same hub area as the yellow switch on Snowy Mountain would have maybe been a bit cluttered, but that's just me. That's not the only oddity involving the volcanic crater's placement on your journey. Up to this point, you've been happening upon lurkers interested in precursor artifacts, trying to excavate them from swamps, and even trying to unseal a massive silo of dark eco on Misty Island. If you trek into Spider Cave, you can even find that they've been digging up a massive precursor robot. This is all likely for those dark figures we saw in the opening cutscene, but their identities aren't revealed until Samos and Kira come through the warp gate. The old sage quickly recognizes the man as Gaul, the sage of Dark Eco, and the woman as his sister, Maya. Their years of experimenting with and exposure to Dark Eco has tainted, twisted, and corrupted them, and now they seek dominion over the world through the power of the precursors and the vast stores of Dark Eco locked away in the silos up north. The reveal is anticlimactic. Setting aside that the score, like every other cutscene outside the opening and the ending, is just the track that plays for the area, Gaul and Maya, named for the Goal programming language and animation software used to make the game, respectively, have had little presence for the majority of the game. Their first appearance was during the opening, and their second is here. There was meant to be at least one additional scene that would play after the player leaves Misty Island, where the two would note that Jak and Daxter might become a problem, and decide to unleash Claw to slow them down at Rock Village, and it had gotten so far as to be recorded and animated before being cut. The animation was found buried in the retail build of the game without audio, but that would be found in a slightly earlier build dated to October 19th, 2001.
Just make sure they don't get too close to our northern operations.
I doubt they'll get that far, but if they do, a surprise will be waiting for them in Rock Village.
So, you're going to let Claw out of his cage?
I think it's worth a risk.
Admittedly, I'm a bit torn on this scene, or at least its intended placement. It's less than a minute long, but putting it in the middle of a sequence when you're traveling back to the mainland feels a bit intrusive. At the same time, though, I've played this game countless times, and I've gotten so used to the little scene that obscures the loading that it's become almost an integral part of the experience for me. As such, forcing in a story scene, even one that is so short, feels like it's slowing the pace down in terms of gameplay. Yet, seeing these two again to remind you that they exist and give a bit of additional context for Claw would have been a positive. Then again, Claw works fine as is in the final game, where he's just a monster attacking a village with dubious ties to all of the other lurker activity. The subtle storytelling that does exist in the final game is also effective as it is. Lurkers are looking for artifacts and finding them. The sages haven't had their gates on because they've mysteriously disappeared. These things appear disconnected, but the fact that it's all happening at the same time gives the impression that they are actually connected. You've got a beat on Gaul and Maya being the cause of it despite not appearing for most of the game, and introducing them and the lurkers at the same time at the beginning is meant to get the player to connect them together. Interestingly, every lurker enemy you come across has some kind of chains, collar, or other restraint on them, implying that they aren't part of Gall and Maya's plot by choice. They may have been enslaved, which is an idea that isn't brought up anywhere, but does add a subtle extra layer to the creature's actions and place in the world. Gall being the one to thwart you at every turn when you were trying to find him to turn Daxter back to normal is a fun twist, and the way he contrasts with Jak is similar to the basic and fundamental way that Crash contrasted with Dr. Neo Cortex. Gall is searching for Precursor artifacts to try and force them to work for him and has been tainted by Dark Eco, whereas Jak has a natural connection to these things. But unlike Crash and Cortex, their animosity isn't built on these contrasts. They're almost entirely incidental without much of a personal connection at all. Even if Crash is all id and acting mostly on instinct, him being the way he is because of Cortex at least gave them an inextricable link to each other. Jak and Gall don't quite have that. That's not to say Gall and Maya are bad villains. They're fine. They work for what this game is trying to do with its story. It helps that Dee Snider of Twisted Sister and Jennifer Haggood turn in great performances. And like the rest of the characters, their designs had a lot of thought put into them. Their gray skin reflects the corruption of the Dark Eco, with both envisioned as evil sorcerers who have been using it for their own selfish purposes for years. Gall sought power, and as a result his body has begun to wither to the point where he's light as a feather, forcing him to tether himself to various anchor points in his underground lair for stability, and weigh himself down with cannon shells whenever he ventures outside his lab lest he float away. Maya, meanwhile, was envisioned as a seer who's been using Dark Eco to keep herself young and beautiful. Gall fashioned some armor to keep the Eco from seeping out of her, while he made himself a powerful gauntlet. Unfortunately, while these concepts that informed their designs are interesting, very little of it comes across in the final game. Well, at least for the most part. They did get to keep their Citadel, and it ends up being the arena for a suitably grand finale. After activating the warp gate outside of Gall and Maya's Citadel, Jak and Daxter are stunned to see only Kira come through the portal. It seems that, as they were zooming through the lava tube, the Dark Eco freaks kidnapped Samos, completing their collection of sages. Inside, a caged Samos tells the dynamic duo that Gall and Maya plan to sap the sages of their energy to power the Precursor robot they've scavenged and retrofitted with parts they procured all across the land. With its power, they'll be able to open the nearby silos filled with Dark Eco and destroy the world. But if Jak can free the sages, they could destroy the force field protecting it, allowing them to find a way to destroy it for good. The Citadel is a truly marvelous final level, being a solid blend of open and linear design while imparting intrigue, unease, and curiosity all at once. It looks like it was actually a Precursor temple at some point, but like its occupants, has been twisted with all of this additional wood, metal, and ivory grafted onto the ancient structure. You're mostly given free reign of where you want to start first, with paths to the red, blue, and yellow sages being accessible from around the shielded robots. The respective platforming challenges are among the hardest in the game, but by this point they're nothing the player shouldn't be able to handle. The sheer scale of it all still continues to invoke that same wonder about the precursors that's been present for the entire game. What was this place originally made for? When I was younger, Kira's line about the warp gate at the Yellow Sage's lab actually had me thinking that the Citadel was originally his lab, and that Gall and Maya attacked him and established themselves here. Now I'm not so sure, but either way, it's an impressive location. It's also where we finally get to meet the other sages, who, despite their extremely limited screen time, all leave an impression. The blue sage is a lithe and energetic nerd who talks fast and has a propensity for sesquipedalian loquaciousness. The red sage is a slow talker with a deep voice and a big heart to match his wide build. And the yellow sage kinda gives off hillbilly with a shotgun vibes based on how he talks and the way he holds his eco cannon.
Who would have thought I'd live to see the day when I needed to be rescued by a boy and his muskrat?
Their personalities each reflect their respective eco-specialties to some extent, which I appreciate. When you free the first 3 sages, you'll be able to go up and free Samos, who for once drops his grouchy demeanor to show genuine appreciation.
Good work, boys. You're real heroes now.
It's a nice gesture, but our work's not over yet. The sages are able to drop the shield, but before Jak and Daxter can figure a way to destroy the mechanical monstrosity it was protecting, Gall and Maya get inside to enact the final phase of their plan. All that's left to do now is take the elevator to the top of the Citadel to face them head-on in one final battle. The tops of the silos and the Citadel are engulfed in a dark mist, making it impossible to see the horizon, no doubt because the silos are beginning to open. It's a grim preview of what's to befall the world if our heroes fail to stop the corrupted siblings. For its final boss, Jak and Daxter has quite the fun set of challenges to overcome. The fight consists of 5 phases, each with its own hazards. For most of them, you'll be picking up yellow eco to destroy various parts of the robots that are either attempting to pry open the silo you're standing on, or trying to kill you. The main exception is the second phase, where instead you'll be using it to defeat dark eco monstrosities that spawn from the silo after Gall and Maya fire some sort of energy into it. Maybe it was green eco, which when it came into contact with the dark eco, created these mutant monsters. In fact, it looks like they're using all 4 types of eco throughout the fight based on the colors of their energy blasts and their basic properties. The first phase sees them firing a blue beam from one of the robot's eyes. The second has green blasts. The third sees it fire a series of red energy bombs which have slowly spreading shockwaves you have to jump over, and the fourth sees them charging up a yellow energy blast similar to when Jak uses yellow eco. It's a subtle detail that ties eco into the whole fight on both sides, as Jak has to use yellow eco to damage the robot, gets only one big piece of green eco to supplement his health at the start of the fight, and between each phase you have to run over to the blue eco vent at the far side of the silo to be able to use the launcher on the other end to avoid the big explosive they deploy that would kill you instantly. All the while, you have to be careful not to either fall off the side of the silo or into the pool of dark eco below as it becomes more and more exposed. It's a great fight, but it wasn't what was originally planned. Earlier outlines had a zoomer chase preceding the fight itself, as previously mentioned, but also the idea of fighting Gall's robot with your own. This would have been propped up by discoveries made earlier in this version of the story, where you would have found a completely intact Precursor robot deep underground. The sage's daughter would have learned that it was powered by the mythical light eco, which may have a chance at turning the sidekick back into a human if they could find it. Later, when going through Gall's, or rather Finn's lair, as was his name at that point in development, the hero would become trapped and would only be broken from containment by the sage's daughter using the robot they found. Doing this would drain the last of its power, but luckily she had become a sage of light eco in the interim, so she would be able to power it up again. To do this, she extracts it from the hero's body, as he would have been accidentally infused with it during the same accident that transformed his friend. But in using it to power the robot, they would lose the one possibly surefire chance they'd have at turning him back to normal. The sidekick would have accepted his fate, and after the zoomer chase, the two would commandeer the robot to fight Finn on an even playing field. As grand as the idea sounds on paper, I personally think that introducing a whole new gameplay style just for the final battle would have been too much of a swerve. Incorporating more of the Precursor's remnants into it would have been neat, but I don't think it would have been worth foregoing everything the player would have used up to that point in favor of throwing an entirely new toolset at them to learn more or less on the spot. Let's be realistic. It's highly doubtful that it would have controlled the same way due to the scale. I much prefer using the final battle as a testing ground for the player's ability to control Jak as a component of the spectacle rather than being entirely spectacle. But that doesn't mean all of the narrative ideas from that outline were thrown out. Gall does still use a Precursor robot, there is a zoomer section leading up to the Citadel, and you do find a Precursor robot in Spider Cave before this, though it doesn't appear to be functional. But most importantly, the last phase of the final battle focuses entirely on light eco. By combining the 4 types of colored eco, the sages are able to produce light eco, alarming Gall and Maya. It has the power to finish them, and they're determined to throw everything at Jak to prevent him from getting even the tiniest bit of it. Daxter, however, theorizes that if dark eco was what transformed him, then perhaps light eco could reverse it. But with how slowly it takes the sages to produce it, and how little they do seem to be able to make, Daxter has to take a second to weigh his options.
Stay fuzzy, save the world. Choices. Okay, fine. will save the world. But do it quickly before I change my mind.
This last phase is a chaotic miasma of hazards that need to be avoided, as Gall and Maya prepare a litany of bombs to take you out and break the already gaping silo completely open all in one go. At this point, you're probably running on your last shred of health, but if you hold out for just that extra few seconds, light eco will start to drop from above. All you have to do is grab it. And when you do... The day is saved, the fog surrounding the Citadel is lifted, Jak and Daxter do a little victory dance, and the sages all express their gratitude. With Gall seemingly destroyed by the very substance which corrupted him, the Red Sage notes that Kira may yet have a chance at becoming a sage like her father, a remnant of the old idea of her becoming the Sage of Light Eco. Samos isn't quite sure if the Dark Eco would have destroyed Gall, though, but Daxter, who's grown to accept his new form, isn't worried. He's confident that he and Jak could handle Gall and Maya again, if they ever return.
Bring him on! We can take him again! Right, Jak? I said, right, Jak? Wow! Put it on ice, big guy!
And so concludes Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. No matter how many times I play this game, I am endlessly charmed and engrossed by its world and characters. It plays well, looks great, and despite whatever minor misgivings I may have about the structure and pacing in the last third, I can easily forgive these minor gripes. The game may feel incomplete in that last stretch, but honestly, just going by the general flow of the gameplay, I feel like having those other two hub areas could have made the whole experience drag a bit. In its current state, the game may feel a little rushed towards the end, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. Moreover, there was enough presented here that could be built upon for sequels, whether it be how we still don't know much about the Precursors or Samos's uncertainty about whether Gall and Maya are truly dead. The story could very easily continue. The secret ending even opens a literal door to future stories. If you collect at least 100 power cells, a massive door at the top of the Citadel will open, but whatever is behind it is obscured by a blinding light. It seems that the team at Naughty Dog were confident that Jak and Daxter would be a success, but whether their newest heroes would be able to measure up to the orange specter hanging over it was a question that could only be answered long after its release.
You think you have it rough? Ever try fighting a dozen lurkers at once? Those guys make purse snatchers seem like Boy Scouts. You fight any 300-foot robots today? Didn't think so.
It looks like your partner's doing all the work.
Maybe it looks that way to the untrained eye. Huh? Hey, big guy! Been there long?
A new legacy is born, ready for everyone.
While Jak and Daxter didn't beat Crash Bandicoot to the PlayStation 2, they clobbered the orange marsupial in reviews. Developed by British studio Traveller's Tales, Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex had a highly mixed reception, owing to its adherence to the same formula, camera and collision issues, and horrendously long load times. The beloved Bandicoot's first proper outing away from his original creators was unremarkable at best, but glowing reviews for Jak and Daxter looked to be painting a bright future for Naughty Dog's newest leading men. In his 9 out of 10 review for the independent PlayStation magazine, Randy Nelson found the game's level design to be among the best he had ever encountered, with character animation comparable to that of Disney. GameSpot's Shane Satterfield would echo these sentiments, adding that the game's sound design and voice acting were top-notch in an industry where these aspects are often neglected. He scored the game an 8.8 out of 10. Game Informer's senior associate editor Andrew Reiner couldn't contain his excitement in his review, which he opened with,
Jak and Daxter, the Precursor legacy, feels as though it were shot out of Shigeru Miyamoto's canon, amalgamating key gameplay components from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64.
Critics across the industry heaped praise upon nearly every aspect of Jak and Daxter. From its visuals to the animation, controls, and technical achievements, there was not only anticipation for this village boy and his rodent sidekicks' continued adventures, but a belief that Sony had found suitable replacements for Crash as mascots for their console. It wasn't seen as a perfect game. It was criticized for having only 3 very simple bosses, mediocre writing, a hollow story with an unsatisfying secret ending, and, despite being set in a single, interconnected world with great controls, still feeling derivative of previous games in the genre. But even so, it wasn't enough for critics to not give the game a hearty recommendation that holiday season. Unfortunately, despite Sony's heavy marketing, Jak and Daxter would fail to crack the top 20 best-selling games of its debut month in North America, and while it did manage to make the number 14 spot in the Japanese sales charts later that month, selling over 40,000 copies within its first few days on sale, it was noticeably behind Crash's latest outing in the territory. But that doesn't mean the game sold poorly. It had sold over 1 million units within its first 3 months on the market. By the end of 2002, Jak and Daxter had sold over 144,000 total units in Japan, and had even spawned a spin-off manga in Basatsu Korokoro magazine, but it was still lagging far behind Crash. By the end of 2007, Jak and Daxter would barely surpass 2 million sales in the United States, narrowly outselling The Wrath of Cortex, but still far short of the original Crash trilogy. And while Evan Wells would confirm that Jak had sold 4.2 million copies worldwide by January 2008, becoming the 17th all-time best-selling game on the PlayStation 2, the first Crash Bandicoot had blown past that in about a third of the time, having sold over 4.49 million units worldwide by February 1999. Jak and Daxter may have been a success, but considering the studio's pedigree, it's surprising that its sales fell so far behind its spiritual predecessor. Critics loved it, players adored it. So, what happened? Jason Rubin would share some of his misgivings about the game, which one could point towards. He felt that, while Jak's design wasn't necessarily bad, it was a mistake to design by committee. He also felt that the word Precursor was maybe a bit too complicated to be used as part of the title. Maybe he was onto something, but there were other factors at play far beyond Naughty Dog or Sony's control. Part of it was that, as noted in reviews, the technical advancements that Naughty Dog had made with the game didn't do enough to set it apart from the likes of Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. It was still very much a 3D platforming collectathon, an exceptionally well-crafted one, but the genre had already been heavily saturated over the past 5 years. Jak and Daxter was gorgeous and innovative with its seamless 3D world, but at the end of the day, it was more of the same. But there's just a bit more to it than that, as James Milkman Milk was quick to point out in his contribution to the game's review in Electronic Gaming Monthly.
Jak and Daxter is one of the best looking games I've ever seen. Sweet graphics, great special effects, etc. And Jak handles like a Bandicoot that's learned some new moves. But therein lies the rub. While the great controls and flashy visuals ensure that someone will enjoy this, these tricks are strictly for kids. Younger gamers will cotton onto this very quickly, and older gamers will yawn.
Not only was Jak and Daxter always going to be compared to the wildly popular Crash Bandicoot, but its release had come right when the 3D platformer wave had begun to crest in North America. The genre didn't die overnight, of course. Plenty of others came out as the generation wore on, but many of those who had grown up with Crash were now looking for more mature games, even if that maturity was mostly superficial. This was reflected in PSM's Best in Show awards for E3 that year, with games like Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, and especially Metal Gear Solid 2 receiving heaps of attention. And this persisted in the bestsellers list for December, which was populated by games like Halo, Max Payne, and, most significantly, Grand Theft Auto 3. Nobody had paid much attention to GTA 3 at E3, but when it hit store shelves in October, it was a juggernaut success. It quickly became the best-selling game of 2001 in the US, with over 2 million copies sold by early February. After just barely a year, it had sold over 6 million units worldwide, made the GTA series the nexus point of the debate over violence in video games, and it would ultimately become the 5th best-selling game in the entire PlayStation 2 library. Grand Theft Auto 3 marked a significant turning point in the video game industry, and its sandbox style of open-world gameplay would not only become aspirational in the years to follow, but, in a way, would eat Naughty Dog's lunch when it came to seamless, free-roaming level design. Jak and Daxter may not have been as successful as Crash, but it was successful. It's been ported to every successive generation of PlayStation. It even got a special limited edition PS4 release from Limited Run Games, which I am incredibly dismayed that I missed, especially since I can't find it on eBay for anything less than $600 freaking dollars. Are you kidding me? I declined to play through every port for this video because, frankly, there's not much of a difference between most of them. The PS3 version is solid and allows you to invert your camera, which is nice. The PS4 version is just an emulator, but despite how much I've heard fans complain about it, I don't think there's anything wrong with it in its current state. Same for the PS5 version, which is basically just the PS4 version with a rewind feature and different trophies. The Vita version, however, is a broken mess. But above all of them is OpenGoal, a fan project which reverse-engineered Jak and Daxter to run natively on any home computer with a couple of quality-of-life improvements. Native 4K resolution and high frame rates, subtitles, inverted camera controls, a proper widescreen mode that doesn't crop the image. It's all there, playable on PC, Mac, or Linux. It was one of the very first things I installed on my Steam Deck, and I'm glad I did. But this passion didn't come off the back of a single game. Jak's initial critical and commercial success practically guaranteed a sequel. But between the steep drop-off in sales compared to Crash Bandicoot, and the way the winds were blowing in the games industry, sticking with the same formula was bound to have led to diminishing returns. The foundation was strong, but the cultural interest had already begun to shift away. If a sequel was to be successful, they would have to adapt to evolving player tastes. And by spring 2002, they were hard at work on realizing a new vision for Jak going forward. No longer would he be a simple, adventurous village boy, but a dark, hardened renegade.